Well, it's now been 10 years since the start of the conflict in the Central African Republic, opposing Seleka and anti-Balaka militias. What quickly turned into a third civil war has left thousands of people dead and well over 500,000 displaced. Behind those staggering numbers, though, are obviously countless civilians forced to make radical decisions amid a devastating conflict. How do you adapt to war? Where do you take your family? And how do you manage a decade's worth of trauma with no end to the conflict in sight? Well, in partnership with Médecins Sans Frontières, Canadian photographer Adrienne Surprenant put faces to these stories for her photo documentary, The Events. She joins me now on set for perspective. Adrienne, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
So can you just remind our viewers of the roots of this conflict? How did it get started and where do things stand today?
So it started in 2013 when the Seleka came and took power in Bangui, the capital of Central African Republic. And so since then, the conflict has moved from outside the capital to the provinces, where it continued, even though we heard less about it in the international media. The last big events were around the elections in 2020 and 2021. Right now, the situation is way more stable than it has been when I was living there and when the conflict first started. But the population still faces a lot of hardships. A lot of people have still not returned to their homes, still live in displacement, either in the capital, in other countries, in other cities where they didn't used to live at first. So through the documentary, we had the chance to meet a lot of people who shared those stories of hardships.
So let's obviously talk about your documentary. We've got some of your photos up here. Can you take us through some of these photos that we see, the people that you met and their stories?
So we had a chance that we had time to talk like a long time with every person we met. We have shared stories of how the families were impacted. We met people like Jean-Marie Sania, who lost a son to the conflict and had to mourn alone because there was still violence sparking in the capital at that time. We met people that are seeking justice now for a lost son, for example. Families that were displaced with members of the families still in various cities that still haven't reunited. There is a testimony also from Nadine, who lost her husband in the recent violence. We have a whole chapter that's also about how people make community and make family still through all those violences. So this was photographed and documented in Carnot, outside of the capital, and it's the story of two men who became real friends in the adversity and who still nowadays support each other. They call each other brothers. Even though one is Christian, the other is Muslim. So we wanted to share at the same time the hardships and to also show those stories of solidarity and how people right now are all exhausted by conflict and violence and are just seeking peace.
So you mentioned the story of those two friends who became brothers, one of whom is Christian, one is Muslim. This conflict has been framed as a religious conflict, opposing Christians and mothers, though Christians and Muslims, though in my understanding that's not necessarily the case. It's more complex than that. How do you think the people that you met perceive the reasons that people are fighting?
People that I've met are all saying that this is a political and economic based crisis, and that basically the population was stuck and utilized in this whole cycle of violence. And so you really have this feeling, and something that was recurrent in all the testimonies, that they have nothing to do with what's happening. So they feel dispossessed from their lives, from simple things, their children going to school, having a decent home, the basics of living, for a conflict that they don't feel implied into. And that is like way bigger than what they have power on.
One of the aspects that you focused on was post-traumatic stress. What did you learn about the psychological toll that the war has taken on the population, especially given the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, there's just one psychiatrist in all of the country?
So I had worked on PTSD and trauma in the Central African Republic. I've lived there. And through all those stories, what shocked me the most maybe is the fact that there's still very little that is done to address mental issues that can be brought by seeing and living and experiencing extreme violence. So in all those testimonies, it was very important for me to be careful, asking certain questions, because you know that people have lived severe trauma. And for a lot of them, it was one of the first times they could really talk about it. So you really face this difficulty of not putting the person back into too many memories and putting the person back into that state of like violence that provoked the trauma, and knowing that they don't necessarily have the same ease at getting psychological support as we would have here in France or elsewhere. So it's a sensitive issue. It's less addressed than it should be, although a lot has been made and has changed. Doctors Without Borders do have programs addressing sexual violences where they offer care and they offer psychological care through that. It's more and more integrated into a lot that's being done in the country. It's still lacking, to my opinion.
How do you think things have changed? You said earlier the situation is maybe a little bit less violent than it was at the start of the conflict, but how do you think things have changed since the arrival of Russian forces in 2018?
So it's a mix. I have not been there as much in the past years, but during the electoral period, there was violent combats between the governmental forces and the allies, including the Russian mercenaries and the Coalition des Patriotes pour le Changement de CPC, who regrouped many armed groups that were previously opposed and formed this coalition. And that was the last big peak of violence. Now there is localized violence. There is also historical cyclic violence that concerns the cattle herding across the country. And there is, it's very sporadic. It's globally more stable. The first time I went in the country, there was no state in most cities. And right now they have reestablished the townships, the town halls, and all of those state structures. So I would say it's easier now for people to access either administration, health, schools than it was. But it's still very tense.
Adrienne Surprenant, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But thank you so much for coming on the show today. And as a reminder to our viewers, you can watch her photo documentary, The Events, on the Médecins Sans Frontières website. That's www.msf.org /10 years, atrocities and violence, Central African Republic.